And so once we get past kind of those studies, so I think of studies maybe correctly or incorrectly as the way to gather data. Where, like, what are the milestones or kind of the stamps of approval? Like, what does that look like? Is that the people who run the study saying, "Hey, stamp of approval, this works"? Is there some kind of overarching, like, a governing body or government organization? What does that kind of approval process look like before it can actually start being given to patients kind of on the ground?
Yeah, so there's basically two different ways. So you either have to come to the FDA with sufficient evidence to show that this medication is safe and beneficial in the treatment of a specific disease. That's the, if you want to call it, on-label use. So that's, what the prescription is designed for, let's say. Doctors also have the option, though, to use medicines off-label, which means this is not the FDA-approved indication for it, but doctors still have the ability to prescribe medications where they think appropriate or necessary in patients that's not the specific indication that the FDA approves. This is where things get interesting, though, because in America, medicine is fairly litigious. So if you, as a physician, deviate from that standard of care, and then something goes wrong, even if that something went wrong was a small percent, and that could happen to either someone with an FDA approved indication, it still makes you vulnerable to a lawsuit. And traditionally, it's academic physicians or physicians who are very comfortable experimenting with new use cases for these drugs that will see those patients. The problem we're seeing in a pandemic is those physicians, those academic ones, they're kind of becoming overwhelmed. You have patients all over. So it's not just a very rare case of something where you're looking for a physician that will treat this thing with this off-label use. You have physicians everywhere that are kind of stuck in this thing where, do I use a certain medication off-label to treat all these coronavirus patients that are coming into my ward, or do I just, give them IV fluids and hope they get better? And that's, I think, the question that a lot of physicians in the U.S. are dealing with right now. And so they're looking for some guidance from the FDA, essentially saying, hey, look, you can use, which that's kind of what Trump did a little bit today. The FDA, I think, backpedaled on that a little bit, but he essentially said, look, I'm approving physicians to use this medication, hydroxychloroquine, in coronavirus patients. I don't know if it's really that hard of that really passed through. I think that there's still some red tape that maybe needs to go through, but that's essentially, I think, what he's aiming at.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see a lot of kind of the bureaucracies and red tape in the healthcare system being almost broken down in this crisis, right? So everything from what you're talking about, kind of the acceleration or approval process, to the ability for a doctor to actually administer healthcare services to a patient in a different state, right? A lot of telemedicine stuff, et cetera. For those that aren't aware of how bureaucratic healthcare is, there's a lot of rules that I think you kind of mentioned earlier make sense sometimes, and other times they seem really stupid, right? And so it takes a crisis like this to kind of break some of those down, and then maybe some of them get reinstated later, or maybe they don't. But it's just been fascinating to me to kind of watch this almost tennis match between, here's the rules today, well, should we keep them, or is this kind of an emergency situation, let's get rid of them?
Yeah, exactly. You kind of take a hard look and say, wait, which of these rules are actually high yield, and which ones are just vestiges of old bureaucracy that is maybe due to lobbyists, or who knows.